Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The Berkeley Book Chats feature a member of the UC Berkeley Arts and Humanities faculty discussing a recently published book with a colleague. Today, we're very happy to welcome Professor Poulomi Saha of the Department of English talking about her new book, Empire of Touch, in conversation with Professor Julia Bryan-Wilson of the Department of the History of Art. Before I turn things over to our guests, since this is our first event of the new year, let me say a few things about upcoming events. This is a remarkably full semester for the Townsend Center. I encourage you to consult our website for a full program of events, which are too many to list here, but I can mention a few. Next week, we'll be welcoming Professor David Henkin of the History Department, talking about his new book on the invention of the week as a unit of time that organizes our experience. That will be a week from today. The week after that, Edward Tyerman of the Slavics Department will be talking about his new book on China and Soviet culture. Speaking of China, we will be sponsoring 3 events in a series called In Dialogue with China, Art, Culture, and Politics on March 2nd, 9th, and 16th. Between now and then, on February 11th, and this is very important, we will be co-sponsoring an event with Margaret Guerrero and David Siegfried of the Foundation Relations and Corporate Philanthropy Department at UC Berkeley on how to get grants for support for research in the humanities and arts. Yes, such a support does exist, and you can find out about it on February 11th at noon. Finally, on April 27th and 28th, we will be welcoming Saidiya Hartman, a professor at Columbia University, as this year's Avenali Professor in the Humanities. So I hope you'll join us for those events, and as I say, there are many others listed on the Townsend Center website. As we turn now to today's event, let me remind you that our guests will speak for about 45 minutes, and after that, the floor will be open to questions from the audience. So please use your chat function to transmit your questions as we go. Now, it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Poulomi and Julia. Welcome to the Townsend Center.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And thank you most of all to Poulomi for inviting me to be your interlocutor today. I want to present the material object. Your book is so much about materiality that I thought I would wield the physical thing itself here for us. We're going to talk about your 2019 book, An Empire of Touch. And I think I want to begin by inviting you to give us a brief overview, but I want to first preface my remarks in our conversation today by saying that when I reread it for today, I was struck once again, or newly struck, by its true brilliance and also its brave creativity. And I think that that's something I want to talk a little bit more about. Your research process, but also how you organize your thoughts in such a dazzlingly fresh and innovative interdisciplinary way. So, but maybe you can begin just by telling us a little bit about the origins of the book and the intervention that you felt you were making.
Yeah, thank you, Julia, for that really so generous introduction. And thank you to Tim and the Townsend Center for hosting this. Thinking about how to prepare for this book chat was interesting because my book has been out 3 years almost today. So it's not a new book by the standards of normal time, but it is a new book still by the standards of academic time. And I've been thinking a lot about the time of writing it. It's a book that spans a little over 100 years of history. And it took me about 10 years to write it. And it's been 3 years. And the world is so radically different than winter 2019 when it came out. And a book about touch then felt important and timely, and now it feels a little melancholic. So much of the tactility of this book, so much of what the book is about the relations between people, between communities, between especially women, making objects. So much of that's been severed from us in the last few years. And so it's pretty difficult to think about what it is in the world right now. When I began this project, it came out of an intellectual problem that it seemed like every idea that I wanted to explore had already been explored by the vast field of post-colonial studies, because I was interested in a place called Bengal. And for a long time, Bengal has been seen as kind of the overstudied site of post-colonial studies. And what I realized as I thought about this object, Bengal, was that actually Bengal was not one thing, but in fact two, that hidden in this apparently overplumbed object was in fact two Bengals. One, West Bengal, which may be familiar to many scholars of the humanities because of the ways in which post-colonial studies seems to derive from it, seem to derive a history of political modernity, of literature, of historiography. The Subaltern Studies Collective, in fact, originates in West Bengal. That Bengal comes to be the synecdoche for India, which then becomes a synecdoche for all of the post-colonial world. And I realized that I was actually interested in the other Bengal, the Bengal that I resurrect in some ways in this book and call by its original name East Bengal. And that Bengal has been relegated actually to social science research. East Bengal, which is today Bangladesh, is seen as a kind of laboratory of development economics. And it offers us things like raw materials and cheap textiles. It is the land of fast fashion. And so as I thought about this object, I decided that I wanted to try and excavate through material objects an object that was apparitional. That is, East Bengal has no real form in and of itself. It is in some part what is today Bangladesh, but not completely. It is an object that appears in literature, it appears in song, but its true material reference seemed to me kind of fleeting. And so I spent 10 years chasing down archives, mostly historical archives, trying to tell a story about political possibilities that we didn't see under the sign of Bengal. And while I was chasing down paper, I found myself really obsessed with cloth, because East Bengal is perhaps most famous for the cloth that comes out of it. From the 17th and 18th century, when it was the main producer of the most valued forms of muslin, what are called takai muslin, to then khadi production in the nationalist period, to handicrafts that now appear through fair trade. Maybe you bought some from 10,000 Villages recently, and also, of course, fast fashion and ready-made garments work. And I found myself thinking about what the relation, if not continuity, between these objects might be, and thinking about how fabric offers us a new way to think about the narratives we can tell about politics, about the past, about desire, and the people who get to make and claim these objects. So this is a book that is deeply embedded in my own desire to touch a form of historiography. And also, as you said, yes, creative is one way to describe it. I think haphazard and promiscuous were other terms that came to mind when I thought about how to do this project. And, now 3 years down the line, I actually don't regret it. I think having to stitch together a diverse archive of material objects, which include fabric, but also include literature and other objects, made me have to rethink what we as humanists know about narrative, how we construct historical narratives, how we theorize major questions like political subjectivity or subjectivity at all. And so this is a book that attempts to do that. It's divided in two parts, much like Bengal itself. The first half is, in fact, a kind of homage to what West Bengal becomes. It takes up texts that will be familiar to many post-colonialists, to many people in English departments or history departments. I read things like Gayatri Spivak's canonical Can the Subaltern Speak? I read the literature of Rabindranath Tagore. I read his correspondence with Sigmund Freud, his correspondence with Gandhi. These are world historical figures in the first half of the book. And the second half of the book, which takes up East Bengal in its post-colonial iteration as Bangladesh, leaves the world historical and it moves to the mundane. It moves much more to the personal, where I read more explicitly textiles. So either the kinds of handicraft quilting that women did as occupational therapy after the 1971 War of Independence in Bangladesh, to its relationship to the resurrection of jambani, which is a form of cotton fabric related to muslin, to garments work. And in those chapters, I have none of my traditional archives. I have none of my traditional, relatively well-honed resources of literary inquiry. And I found that I had to think anew about how to talk about objects and reading them. And so the book attempts, on the one hand, to track a long history, but it doesn't claim any mastery over that history. I think what I learned at the end of it was it is impossible to produce a masterful account of things that are always under a kind of necessary erasure. Many of the subjects and objects in this book are unruly. They're difficult to place within the easy narratives that we have of the nation, of politics, of literature. And so the book has to grapple with difficult objects and subjects. So yeah, that was my thinking in the writing of it.
It's a really hard book to summarize. It's a really hard book to summarize.
I know, it's a terrible.
That's for sure. I mean, I would not use the word haphazard. Promiscuous, yes, I love that. Unruly, yes. But it's such a convincing structure. And let me just pull out, you mentioned a few of the objects of inquiry that you focus on as you trace these really disjunctive histories that you weave together. I'll just say a few more of them because I love, to me, it is such an act of world making that you're attempting in this book, is to put together very surprising archives. So here's just a little sample. Men's clothes worn on a revolutionary female body as she burns herself in protest. Tagore's notion of the fetish. Gandhi's feminized body next to his spinning wheel. Freud's ivory statue of Vishnu. A burned state archive of testimony about political violence against Bengali women in 1971. Singer sewing machines. Embroidered quilts. I mean, this is a very capacious idea of what texts are, because you do move very fluently between really thinking about the political economy of textiles, but then going into textile also as a metaphor, of course. So, and I want to, I think, talk a little bit more about how you understood what you were doing within the rubric of English literature, which is the department that you are in currently. I mean, I do think it should be really underscored that this is your first book. You wrote it pre-tenure. Now you have tenure. It's an award-winning book now, but we can't know that when we start these ventures, and that just the extraordinary risks that to me, it really felt like you were taking here. Because we are, like, disciplines are by nature conservative, and we are in institutions that do uphold, that are gatekeeping and they're policing around their boundaries, et cetera. So maybe it may all seem now, looking back on it, like, oh, great, I'm so glad I did that. I wouldn't have done it any differently. But weren't you a little afraid, or weren't there some hesitations?
Yeah, I was terrified. I mean, I had a moment. Actually, so the first chapter of the second section starts with me recounting what it felt like to sit in the waiting room of the Bangladesh National Archives as they were thinking about whether or not they'd give me access to these records of women who had been raped during the war. And every day I sat there and they brought me tea and they kept asking for more documents. And I was sure in that moment that the writing of this pre-tenure book was utterly stalled. I couldn't write it. In fact, someone said to me, well, it's great. You have a perfect metaphor here. Bangladesh is a kind of failed state. So, not getting access to the archives is a perfect metaphor for the state. And I thought, I don't want to write that. I don't want to write this book. And at the same time, like I said, I was fascinated by these textiles and I thought I could write about it. But there's no way, one, a publisher is going to publish this book because its structure is insane right now. Its structure is split fundamentally. And also that my department, which is very literary, would believe that this passed muster for what a tenure book should be. And I think we've all had those kind of dark, stormy nights of the soul. And I decided that, and this was hubris at that point, it worked out, but I thought either I write the book that I feel like I need to write, and I may not get tenure and I may never have another job in academia, but it will have been a good way to spend 10 years of my life. Or I write a mutilated book and I can never write another book again. It really did feel like those were the stakes. And by the end, especially when I was deep in this material on East Bengal, it felt so exigent. It felt like I had to draw these connections between the way Bangladesh is understood now in development economics as a place where you can chart market economic success by the number of women who enter into the garments work labor force. And that on the one hand, and on the other hand, this kind of international reviling of garments work as a site where women are exploited and women surely misrecognize what they're doing. That these conversations actually were directly linked to the way in which Gandhi thought of fabric in the nationalist period as not just some basic technology of national independence, but as actually a self-making process. Mm-hmm. Gandhi really saw khadi as a thing that made new people, that in the spinning and weaving, you became a new person. And I thought there's something so essential about this link, the way in which we've also come to value that form of fabric, whether it is buying it at something like 10,000 Villages, or in India, khadi has this extraordinary cultural and economic cachet. So you can buy beautiful designer khadi, and you fetishize it. You'll tell people where you got it, and either the atelier or the cooperative who made it. But being able to draw the link between these highly valued and venerated objects, which can be tied to national liberation, with mundane, kind of embarrassing fabrics, right? I kept thinking about how we're always kind of embarrassed to admit we're wearing a t-shirt from H&M, right? It implicates us not just in bad labor practices, but in bad taste. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to think about taste in some ways, right? And the kind of, not just economics of taste, there are people who do that, but to think about the kind of historical structure that makes taste a kind of post-colonial problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I really felt I'm glad you talked about your feeling of urgency in finishing this book at the moment, because it does feel like it was published in 2019, obviously in the before times, and it has circulated over the last few years in this really, ever-changing landscape of uncertainties. But you do firmly say, I can read this quote to you because it struck me as articulating the stakes of what you were doing, you say, this book is utopian. It sees desire as political and feminine labor as imagining collective life and commitment otherwise, which not only are you, I think, marshaling this really unbelievably various set of archival instances in order to make this convincing argument, but you also are making a claim for what it is to do these readings. And you are making a claim for what it is to be a humanities scholar in the late, in this moment. And I think that for you to use the word utopian, I'd love for you to reflect on that. And especially because you link utopianism to feminine labor and to desire and to collective life. So, and commitment otherwise. I mean, this is a really important and dense phrase, I think, that I want to hear you unpack a little bit. So take me back to the utopianism, I guess, of the book, and maybe it feels more melancholy now than it did in 2019.
Yeah, I think utopian was the term I turned to as a way to not rescue Bangladesh or women's labor from failure, but to say that failure, it was never failed. None of these projects have been failed. The teleology that we have inherited, and we all know it's fake, right? The story of post-colonialism, of anti-colonialism, of decolonial praxis that we want to imagine is some unbroken, progressive historicism. We know it's not real. And yet we are compelled, and we see such productive, generative things within it. And so I use the word utopian as a way to let me return to moments where I see what I call a collective effervescence. This book is episodic rather than progressive. And I pick these episodes in which something emerges, something so gripping that distinctly doesn't come to pass in the form of, say, an independent nation state. Mm-hmm. So the first chapter on Predilater, who was a 21-year-old revolutionary who kills herself after she carries out a actually successful terrorist attack against a European club in Chittagong in 1931. And the mystery of her body found dressed as a man, and indeed as a Muslim man, was in some ways, why was she dead when she didn't seem to be injured, when the attack had happened elsewhere, she had absconded safely. And one reading of her body was that she had failed somewhere, right? She'd failed to live. She had failed to be a hero in life. And instead, what you find as they actually unwrap her body in the autopsy is her body is pinned with writing, some of it her own, some of it not, in which she says, "I boldly declare myself a revolutionary." And she gives herself to this vision of the nation. And she dies for a future she will not come to see, and indeed a future that doesn't come to pass as she imagines. And yet there is something so rich and riveting about that. And it's not just me. Public imagination returns to it over and over again. There's a moment 5 years later where her face and pamphlets of her face are firebombed into the police headquarters. To this day, when I was in Dhaka, women would bring me over to meet their quite young daughters and introduce them as Predilater. She has a life that is very different. And I wanted to think about what it would mean to highlight this kind of labor, an embodiment that doesn't seem to give rise to independent India, and to reinscribe it alongside things like women who were raped during the war when they were sent to these rehabilitation camps in 1972. And many of them never spoke again of being in those camps, but during their time, they produced all kinds of material, literally, in the form of stitched cloth and embroidery, which has now set the model for cooperatives. And the prior history of those cooperatives, which are now circulating globally, has to kind of be erased for fear that it might be seen as some kind of failed start, right? That to begin with a moment of sexual violence, to begin with a moment of rape during war, to begin also with a moment where women don't emerge triumphantly and announce themselves as some victorious war hero, though that's the name they're given. It seemed important to me to highlight what emerges, what is made, and the imagination, and I mean this literally, I don't mean it speculatively, that drives these objects. So the book is utopian because it takes these moments where something emerges. It does not come to pass in the progressive form, but it still exists and it makes something. And I wanted to see if I could try and capture these moments. And what I found is also in trying to capture them, what I had to do away with was things like the figure of the individual, the identifiable subject, right? While I have Gandhi and Freud and Tagore, they're kind of red herrings in this book for other forms of feminine imagination, some of which they're implicated.
They're supporting, they play a supporting role, you know? They are definitely not the protagonists. I mean, I actually wanted to show, because I love that there's a few moments where there's, you know, visual material that punctuates the text. And I wanted to just show, because I find her so intense and amazing, this beautiful photograph that you reproduce. And it is these women who become the heroines, really. I mean, not that this book is nothing to do with a simplistic idea of utopia. I just want to make sure that everyone knows that. There's not, you don't drive your story towards some kind of easy resolution. You know, there is so much messiness. There's so much kind of productive rupture, etc. But I'd love to hear you talk actually about how you did. I mean, the primary method, I would say, if we were going to speculate about a method here, you do prioritize questions of tactility. It is a kind of an archive of, it is about intimacy, it is about tactility, it is about a kind of haptic imagination. But you also do have these moments that happen in the register of the visual. And maybe talk us through the decision to include a photograph like that, where you do a reading that has everything to do with opticality, you're moving into a different kind of sensorial regime.
Well, the visual, I mean, I think in some ways is so tied in to touch, especially when so many of the objects that I was invested in don't exist anymore. And like the kind of example is when I became particularly fascinated with muslin. I realized that the best examples of muslin, of this Takai muslin, exist now in two forms, either as museum pieces or in personal family collections. And so I spent a lot of time hounding museum curators to let me touch textiles in small museums across South Asia. Always refused, right? Where they said,
yeah, I mean, I'm like, what are you talking? Can I come and do everything you are here to police against? Can I come and just be the bull in the china shop and, get my dirty oils all over your precious artifacts?
Exactly. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted my body to be implicated in the texture of these textiles. And all of the museum curators said, absolutely not. You can look, you can take a photo, and a photo does no justice to these fabrics. And in fact, the cover of my book is a close-up from the Victoria and Albert Museum, so an imperial museum, of Takai muslin from the late 18th century. And you can even see there's a thread of gold that's woven through it. And you get some sense of its ethereality, how fine. They used to say that 9 yards of Takai muslin could be folded into a matchbox, which it's impossible to imagine. But I wanted to touch it, and instead I could only see it. In family collections, on the other hand, people let me touch this textile because they themselves touched it. They would bring it out and often press it to them because it would be a grandmother's sari, or napkins that had been made out of the scraps of some other previous cloth. These were tactile, but I found that I was always kind of being limited by what I could touch and having to think about what I could see instead. Sometimes that was really also very important. So that image of Predilater that you saw was a kind of hard fought one to find, because there are no images of her body as is extensively described in the archive, where she was found dead, dressed as a man. Instead, in the police archives are there two images side by side, one a close-up of her and one of her sitting in a chair. And these are insistently the only reproduced images of this young woman. And they're ones that restore her to a kind of recognizable femininity, that frees her in this way that is, on the one hand, really important to a particular project of her being a female revolutionary, and also somewhere denude her of what made her such an unruly, both historical and material figure, right? When she was dressed as a man and when she died dressed as a man. So a lot of the book is about grappling with, in some ways, two-dimensionality with surface, and thinking about when surface is not just a surface. So in these images, these historical images, there's that one. There's also a historical image that I found that I had never seen before, which is of Tagore and Freud in their first meeting. One of the images has been reproduced. I'll find it here. This first one has been reproduced before, but this one I had never seen. And so I found myself looking at these images that aren't circulating in other places. I find in the dustiest corners of archives, and trying to understand what moment they were freezing, what was being laminated in the surface of this apparently stilled image.
And tell us about your decision to include them for the reader. So it's one thing, because I think you are grappling with so many archival losses and having to reconstruct things, and you make a lot of imaginative leaps. It's one of the things I really deeply respect about the creativity, as I called it, of this book. But so the inclusion of those archival images to be available to the reader, I mean, it's an act of generosity, I guess, but maybe say a little bit more about, did you have to fight with your press to include those?
No, I was very lucky. One, the press was quite open to including anything, but also because I was lucky enough to have a subvention. And again, if we're going to drop the curtain on a lot of how academic writing and first books work, is subventions are the way forward. You bring money and a press will let you do a lot of things. Certainly I can't forget that the most expensive image in this book is the most famous one, and one that everyone knows. And I still sometimes wonder why I chose to include it. I'm not sure anymore. So this is the Margaret Burke White image of Gandhi at his sewing machine. I had to pay $1,000, which is a lot of money. But I also was gifted an archive in the last chapter when I'm writing about these women who were in the rehabilitation camps, and I found myself unable to find an archive. People would, throughout Dhaka, open up their own personal memories to me, would share things. But I found myself still missing objects. And I came back from a long research trip, again, sure that I couldn't write the book I wanted to write. And I was reading a book by Nayanika Mukherjee, who wrote a book called The Spectral Wound on the 1971 War of Independence in Bangladesh. And she there had an image by a photographer that I'd never seen before, an image of a woman who was in the rehabilitation camp. So I looked up this photographer. It's a small world in some ways of Bangladesh studies, and especially of humanist Bangladesh studies. And I couldn't find any other work by her, but I did find a ceramicist who lived in Colorado with her name. And so I wrote to her, and, I did a little bit of extra detective work. It was a woman of the right age, and she wrote back and said, yeah, that was me. This was a young woman who was in Dhaka during the war alongside her then husband, who for their honeymoon, he was a National Geographic photographer, took her along to document the war. And she began her own photographic project and took hundreds of photos, not just at the rehabilitation camps, but throughout, and had decided that she was going to write an article for National Geographic. And so collected an enormous tranche of material, and then found herself unable to put it into writing, to actually articulate what she had seen and the toll of the war. And so she wrote to me and she said, I'm so sorry, I don't know where it is. I only have that image that I had sent to Nainika. And I said, that's fine. This is a book where I'm just chasing ghosts. It's okay. But if you'll chat with me, I would be so grateful. And then 2 days later, she said, please check your mail. I went upstairs after we talked, and in my attic, there was this box that I was sure was lost. And so suddenly I had this box that arrived, which I had become the steward of. And so I felt it was important for me to reproduce some of those images. But what is also happening, which is an exciting second project, is that I'm in the process with a small collective of putting together a crowdsourced online archive called That Was 1971, in which we're inviting people to share digitized copies of material that they have from the war, whether it's personal photographs, other archival material, and to try and think about what is the kind of visual archive that is available that is not included in traditional places, and that can actually be preserved and reproduced in new forms, and to allow for a more variegated narrative of the war and its aftermath.
Well, that's amazing. I was going to ask you if this book has launched any new projects for you, or what directions you were going in, and that sounds like a public service as well as a humanities project. And maybe, but I do want to give you time to answer if there's other projects that you're working on that are coming out of this, or where you're rethinking some of this material, or basically, what are you working on now question?
I'm doing something very different right now. Its roots are still somewhere in this book, but I'm currently writing a book on cults, on Hindu cults in America. But I'm writing right now an essay related to that book about hugging, and reflecting on a real longing for touch and what has happened to us in the last 2 years as we've been severed from the ability to even casually hug, and thinking this through a figure who features in my new book, Amma, who is called the Hugging Saint. She is a South Indian woman who has become globally famous for these marathon hugging sessions where you go and stand in line and she'll hug you. And I think that nothing has made more clear to me why you may do that and what you might get out of that than being deprived of casual and really of the particular intimate contact of hugging. So
I love that you're working on Amma. That's so great. I have a friend who stood in line for hours to get one of Amma's hugs, and a single person, unattached, not in a couple form. And apparently Amma, if you come as a couple, she gives you the same amount of time as she does. You get half the time as if you, I don't know if you've gotten one of these hugs, but my friend felt like it was one of the very few instances where it was better to be alone than to be with someone, because there's so much couple privilege, but with Amma, she felt like she got the dedicated attention that she really wanted.
It's the most intense, impersonal intimacy imaginable. Mm-hmm. It's so intense, and you're one of tens of thousands.
Right. I love also from your previous comment about when you were working on this book, you called it Chasing Ghosts, which I think is a great title for something. I don't know. You could maybe for the band that we need to start.
Yes.
Chasing Ghosts. I see that there's some questions from the audience, and please, audience, ask your questions. But I did also want to ask you, Poulomi, if the book has, we talked a lot about the kind of bravery, or what I consider the bravery of the book and the riskiness, but it has been very warmly received. And I was just wondering if you wanted to reflect a little bit on how it has circulated in maybe unexpected ways, if there's been anything that has been moving to you. I mean, I always feel like I'm going to cry with gratitude if anyone tells me like, oh, I read something that you wrote, because it can be very isolating actually to be, to publish things. You just really feel, sometimes you can just feel like it's going into the void and, the signal has not been received. So, but maybe just, how has it been to have it be in the world?
It's been it's been super humbling, honestly. It did win the ACLA Harry Levin Prize a couple of years ago, which was remarkable. It's an academic prize, and I am in no way minimizing how really blown away I was by that. But actually, I get occasionally emails from people who have roots in East Bengal, who read the book and found themselves really moved. The first one I got was from a woman who is herself an author, but also is a perfumier, let's say. And she talked about the kind of sensorium of reading the book. And I printed out the email. It's extraordinary to feel also that an academic book, which for me at times the academicness on the one hand is how I think and write, but also felt kind of alienating to what became a really personal project, that something of the personal and the human and the communitarian that I was striving for has broken through. So that's the most exciting for me always. And the idea that, there's something alive in it, especially the textile. And it is actually that which people respond to it the most intensely. Well, people will say, my grandmother had this, or my mother told me a story. And these are matrilineal stories of often either textiles you've seen or ones that are lost. And I think I'm not the only one chasing these ghosts.
Yeah, my work about textiles has been the most warmly, that's been the thing that I feel like has had a readership, and I'm so grateful for that. But there is something, textiles surround us from the moment that we are born until we die. And we just have such an incredible intimacy with them. And people are very invested for all kinds of reasons, because they are makers themselves, or because of different labor formations, or because of, gendered making. It's like, and as I said to you before, I wish that I had your book as a model when I wrote my own book that has some interesting overlap with yours about gendered labor, and the word contingency is very important for both of us. There are some questions, and I'm wondering, Poulomi, if you can help me read them. They all are really great. The first one is, you said earlier that you wanted to think about taste as a post-colonial problem. Could you expand on that and reflect a bit more?
That's a great question. I think partly it is because of when I say taste, I mean also objects that we can talk about as being aesthetic, and how intensely one narrative of post-colonial studies has hewed itself to what we would call aesthetic objects, right? So Gandhian khadi, for example, as this venerated post-colonial object, in some ways is venerated against its material life. The khadi that Gandhi made was distinctly unbeautiful by the other standards that we think about cloth and textiles, beauty and quality. That khadi is markedly rough. It's supposed to reveal that a non-professional, non-artisan made it. That is its very point. You were supposed to be able to tell that an ordinary person made for themselves the cloth that they're wearing. That has, on the one hand, that kind of transformation of mundane, unbeautiful, rough cloth into a highly valued object is in a really strange relation to the technological miracle of knit, right? So the clothing that we're so embarrassed to wear, the Gap or H&M t-shirt, is a modern miracle that you can have knitwear, which is textile, often cotton and polyester blend, that is so thin and so finely woven as to be almost imperceptible to your skin. We undervalue that, partly because of the economics of its labor, while we hypervalue this other thing. So I'm trying to think not necessarily of like, now let's hypervalorize knitwear, but rather what would it mean for us to think about all of these as aesthetic objects and to think about the various economies of taste, but of also political life that have made it so we understand them so differently? That's a great question.
Yeah, great question. I've been so surprised during the pandemic how little people, as much as we all have this incredible knowledge, this bodily embodied knowledge about textiles, there's also such vast ignorance. So the idea that, oh, you're supposed to wear woven cloth mask as opposed to knit, open knit cloth, like those are really different techniques of making, and that people we've become so alienated or estranged, many people, from these fundamental processes that they don't know the difference between like what is woven cloth versus what is stretchy knit cloth anyway. And that actually that has there's life or death stakes to that question, in this moment. Anyway, so another question is, could you talk a bit more about the usefulness and limitations of building your book as an episodic structure? What does that help you do or keep you from doing?
It's a good question. I will admit, again, the limits of my own training. I am not a historian, and I wouldn't actually know how to write a historical narrative well, I think. So on the one hand, that limited me, but it also freed me in some ways because I didn't have to follow those constraints. And so the book actually begins in 1931, but then goes back to an earlier moment in 1916. I was able to move in ways that were more mobile and draw connections because I believe in contingency. The book is organized theoretically around this idea of contingency, which is another way of saying coincidence. That in some ways I believe in the theoretical and hermeneutic power of coincidence, that when you see a connection, when two things touch over and across time and space, there is something happening there. So the episodic structure let me actually reveal more clearly what I saw the work of contingency being. Contingency, of course, coming from the Latin of con with tangere for touch, so to touch together, and that these were moments of touch across time, space, objects, sometimes even legible form. And so it, on the one hand, freed me, but it is not always in the writing of a book good to be fully freed from clear methodology. It's actually terrifying and exhausting and can produce a lot of mess. So, if we're going to reveal kind of process, this book had to go through pretty massive revisions in order to come to a kind of clarity, or at least a trajectory about why these episodes work together. Its first incarnation was, I think, much less productive because it didn't quite know how to bring together things that appeared to be encountering one another in random ways. So a lot of that happened in revision and in restructuring.
Well, I love talking about revisions. I think it's very underrated as a form, in terms of talking about the craft of writing. So I want to ask you more about that.
Yeah.
Did you find yourself, was it a matter of editing out? Was it a matter of putting more in? Or was it a matter of signposting and revealing transitions? Or was it all of those things, or something else I haven't mentioned?
It was a little bit of all of those things. I also really love talking about revision. I love talking about labor. I think actually, again, this book is really big on it, but in general, I think that when it's nice that something is beautiful or well regarded as a final object, it's especially important then to show the labors of its making. And I think Suzanne has a question about the relation between the first and second parts of the book. And actually, this might helpfully reveal the labor, which is that when I first started to put these things together, I had really well-meaning, actually brilliant and generous interlocutors who would say to me, the problem with this book is you're going to have a lot of people who want to read the first half and will stop reading when they get to the second, and a lot of people who might not even get to the second half because they're not going to want to read the first half. And there's like a tiny Venn diagram overlap of people who might want to read the whole thing. The question is how to make it so you make it one much larger circle. And so I found myself actually pulling apart all of the chapters first. It had first moved historically. So it went from 1916 and moved in order. And I felt like it was important to take out this first chapter on Predilater, which is a kind of theoretical chapter, and place it at the fore, to want to disrupt any fantasy that we're going to move in order, and to announce quite openly the stakes. So I do a lot of kind of announcing of either connections or discontinuities. I also felt like it was important to signpost the shift and to say, readers who felt comfortable in the first half may find that my tone has totally changed, my objects are different. And you have to, in some ways, ask a reader to take that risk with you. It is, I did make the mistake once of looking up the book's reception on Twitter, and there are several grumpy people who were like, I was so excited to read a book on textiles, and do you know that she talks about literature? And I'm not interested in allegory. And I thought, fair enough. It is entirely reasonable.
Never look at the reviews on Twitter. I mean, that's not going to give you anything useful. Yeah, I was completely riveted the entire way through. And now I've read it twice. So it's like, it really holds up. It really does. It's so beautifully written. So beautifully written. But I do, maybe we could, just because I think it's so actually very helpful for graduate students, if any of them have tuned in, to hear about the struggles of revising. And especially, I assume this was your dissertation, it started the kernel of, it was not. Okay.
This is the thing. This book was not my dissertation, and it required me, which was, again, another terrifying, potentially disastrous decision that turned out okay. And again, if we're going to reveal labor, we should also reveal resources. Having this job, which gave me time and extraordinary resources, made it possible for me to start from scratch, to spend a lot of time in archives, to fail several times over, to hire really good help. I had an extraordinary research assistant, Ramsey McLaser, who kept me in line, who actually helped me.
Hey, Ramsey.
I know. Well, we should thank extraordinary people who make this possible. This is a populated book. It's not just me. There are lots of people that made it possible. But I think that the key somewhere is to know, to get to a moment where you can't not write something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we should all, my first book, which was a revision of my dissertation, it was definitely not the book that I would have wanted to write. It was coming from a lot of disciplinary insecurities, I guess. As dissertations often do, which is kind of, and just a lot of compromises, a lot of internal compromises and external compromises that, and I look back at it as a deeply flawed record of that, but which is okay. That's often what they are, but I do think it's better. It's just more gratifying in all kinds of ways to go with what you're really deeply passionate about. And that is the more fulfilling kind of writing. And it is a more fulfilling, kind of reading as well.
And let us hope that we're all able to do that. I mean, academic publishing is a perilous, perilous process. I mean, I'm so glad that we have these book chats that show the amazing work that comes out at the end. But, the reality is that it is really difficult. Presses are under a ton of pressure for marketing purposes and to think about readership. And that pressure really kind of comes down, especially to junior scholars. It's
I know.
And yeah. I think it's important for readers and for scholars to push and to make sure that presses are publishing weird, interesting things and things that they think have a supposedly niche audience. Because I think academia should have niche audiences. We're in it for niche audiences, but it's important for good scholarship to not feel like you're diluting an idea just to get published.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why I so applaud all the, surprising choices that you make here, because you're definitely not trying to fit yourself into a presumed, an expectation of what I think that to me is one of the most like bracing and kind of tonic aspects of this book, is how much you do kind of, it is really, it's excessive in a way. You're spilling out of many boundaries. And I think that to me is really, really beautiful. And definitely, I'm so glad it's been, materially rewarded with your tenure and your award, et cetera. And I do encourage, I think it's really important for younger scholars to see that as an example.
Thank you.
I think we actually are at time with our hour. It flew by because it's always a pleasure to talk to Poulomi about all things, including textiles and possible band names.
Come back for our band chat.
That's right. And I want to thank also, of course, the Townsend Center for hosting, and to the audience for joining us today. And Poulomi, once again, thank you for your the contributions that you've made to the world of textiles and feminist scholarship.
Julia, thank you. This was so fun. And really, I can't imagine a more generous or fun interlocutor. So thank you guys.
Cheers. Bye.